Hello, listeners, and welcome back to another episode of Political Pulse, where we converse with world-leading experts about the current political climate across the world.
Here with us today is Ambassador Vasyl Myroshnychenko, who is the current ambassador of Ukraine to Australia and New Zealand.
We have the pleasure of having him on the podcast today, coming all the way over to Perth from the Ukrainian Embassy in Australia.
The ambassador has completed achievements in the London School of Economics and Politics, the American University, Lehigh, University College of Business, and the Taras Shevchenko National University of Kiev.
He is a very qualified individual and proves to provide very personal and valuable information in the crisis occurring in Ukraine. It is truly a pleasure to have you here on the podcast today, Ambassador.
It's a great pleasure for me to be here at Scotch College. I'm very impressed. I met your students from the middle school and great questions out there. So my expectations for you are very high.
Okay, so firstly and foremostly, can you describe your experiences in Ukraine in the last couple of years?
Look, the last couple of years, I was in the private sector. I was running a consultancy in Ukraine. But since 2014, when Russians first invaded Ukraine, I was part of the Ukraine civil society. And because I was in strategic communications business, my company offered assistance to the government back in 2014 to help with international communications. Because the idea was how to get a story across to the international audience, how to make sure that Ukraine's voice is amplified, and how people understand what's happening with Russia invading Crimea, with Russians getting into the eastern part of Ukraine. So at that time, we created an NGO called Ukraine Crisis Media Center, and that NGO was set up by several companies, including mine, where we had a group of 50 people who ran a news agency, pretty much, multilingual news agency, telling the stories from Ukraine. Interestingly enough, that was the time when MH17 flight was downed by the Russians over the territory of Ukraine, which killed almost 40 Australians. I think it's 39. Don't quote me on that. I mean, the numbers have to be checked. It was interesting. Your foreign minister, Julia Bishop, came to Ukraine in 2014. And I moderated her press conference. I was moderating a press conference with her to the international journalists. And when I came here to Australia, it just coincided that my first meeting was with the Chancellor of the Australian National University, and that was Julia Bishop. So I go into that meeting last year in March and say, Ms. Bishop, you won't believe it, but we met 8 years ago. Now it's 9 years ago, but at the time it was 8 years ago. So what a coincidence. I think I was meant to come to Australia from a long time ago.
Yeah. Ambassador, do you think that the information from the war in Ukraine could contribute to the learning of students across the globe, in context of individual students from Ukraine immigrating to other parts of the world, such as Australia, for example?
No, absolutely. I think we now have so many Ukrainian students who are now outside of Ukraine. A lot of them are still in schools. They are there with their mothers mostly. And but I think what's important is for Ukrainian students to have an opportunity to come and study in Australia. Mm-hmm. And I'll just give you some of the examples. When I was growing up, I went to high school in America on a high school exchange program. And I just spent 1 year in high school. I was 15 at that time. And that was a program funded by the US government. I stayed with the host family. I went to just a regular high school. But it was 96. So in those days, Ukraine looked very different. And that 1 year that I've spent there had a profound impact on my life afterwards. And then later on, I studied in the US. I studied in Britain, where I did my master's degree. I also studied in Sweden, spent lots of time in Germany. And every time I would go abroad, I would learn something new. And that would always be very enriching experience. So I think I encourage you to take an opportunity and go on an exchange to a different country. Also, I think Ukrainian students would benefit from coming to study here, either at a school level or at a university level. And because I think that what makes us, changes our outlook on the world. It gives us new experience, different experience. And I think it just makes us better. It just makes us more international, makes us more global, and more understanding about other issues anywhere in the world. Yeah.
What do you think of the ramifications of this war on education?
They're huge, I think. And we've just gotten out of COVID, right? We've seen what COVID has done to education, how it had changed the entire system, right? But I think the impact on education, especially in Ukraine, has been devastating. Russians have destroyed many universities in Ukraine. Many schools have suffered as well. And generally, our educational system is in really bad shape, because you can't really have an education system when you don't have students, right? So a lot of them left, especially who were underage and who were not drafted into the army. They left the country, and we need to make sure that we can win the war and these people can come back, because we'll need the people to rebuild the country. But generally, I think any war anywhere, I mean, it's really kids are those who suffer most, because this is the most vulnerable group, and this is what we see.
Do you think there had been a change in what it means to identify as Ukrainian?
Oh, that's an excellent question, and I think we've seen it quite a lot, because for a long time that identity question and the identity of a Ukrainian was not that clear, especially after Soviet Union collapsed. When Soviet Union collapsed, a lot of people still felt they were a bit Soviet, right? Because they still grew up in that system. And all of a sudden, they kind of gained a new national identity. But it was not fully embraced, because it takes time to fully embrace it. For a lot of people, they would identify themselves as citizens of Ukraine, as passport holders of Ukraine, but not necessarily maybe Ukrainian, right? As you know, half of the country speaks Ukrainian language, half of the country speaks Russian language. So we have also these different languages which have been used. But I think in 2014, we've seen a rebirth of a Ukrainian nation. Because when Russians invaded Ukraine first time, what I've seen is actually turned out that Russian-speaking people of Ukraine are actually Ukrainian. And they made it very clear to Vladimir Putin. They said, look, we don't need your help. We are fine in Ukraine. We don't feel any problem with speaking the language we want to speak, right? And I think this is something that Vladimir Putin has underestimated. I think he thought that if you speak Russian, you must be Russian. But look, it's not true, because speaking English language does not make you English, right?
Yeah.
You're Australian. Talk to Irish people, how they feel about it. They all speak English, right? And that's a different case. And I think this is something which maybe the world has not grasped or could not understand about Ukraine. But for us, now being under the Russian attack, we've seen a birth of a political nation, all-inclusive nation. People of different languages, of different ethnic backgrounds, of different religions as well. For instance, I'm a Catholic, but most of Ukraine is Orthodox, right? It's 90% Orthodox. We also have an indigenous community in Ukraine called Crimean Tatars. They're Muslim. They're, by the way, suffering quite a lot because they are under Russian occupation in Crimea. This is where they live, and they have had some hard times there. But what I've seen since this war, Russia has bombed all the Russian-speaking cities of Ukraine, like Chernihiv, Kharkiv, Kherson. These are cities which are predominantly Russian-speaking, and they've been bombed by Russian planes and missiles, right? And I think I've never seen such a big resistance. So I have a lot of friends who used to speak Russian within the family, and like 90 years ago they told me, Vasyl, we switched language. From now on, we're going to speak only Ukrainian at home, so that our kids, they will learn it as a native language, and that will be their native language, because my friends tell me their parents used to speak Ukrainian, but then they kind of lost it, right? Because we were part of a big Russian empire. We're just a colony. And when you're part of colony, those who colonize you want to forget your own identity, want to forget your own language. And Russia has imposed themselves for 300 years. Russians have been killing Ukrainians for a long time. They've been destroying our identity, our culture, our literature. And that was an oppression that we were exposed to for such a long time. Even if you look at the 20th century, the past century, when Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed, and the Russian Empire collapsed. Ukraine became independent in 1917. That independence lasted 4 years. We had 3 different governments there, and the Bolsheviks, communists came, and they took over Ukraine. They declared Soviet Union in 1922. And then in 1932-33, Ukrainians were forced into collective farms. And for Ukrainian, having his or her piece of land is sacred. We didn't want to join collective farms. To force us into collective farms, Stalin has organized an artificial famine which killed over 5 million people. 5 million people were just killed because they had no food. And that was used as a way to suppress any resistance to that collectivization. In the late 30s, Stalin was fighting Ukrainian nationalism. And to fight the Ukrainian nationalism, they would take all the elites of Ukraine, all the writers, composers, philosophers, all those people from the cultural industry, so to say, right, who were intellectuals, right, who were shaping the public opinion. They were just killed. And then the Second World War came, and we've seen so many atrocities during the Second World War, and there were more Ukrainians killed in that war than any other nation in Europe, because a lot of the battlefield was in Ukraine, then followed to Belarus, and then Russia only later on. So through all the suffering that we've seen, and Russia always has been dominating and kind of trying to erase our identity, our culture. So it's been kind of natural. And, learning that in history classes in the 90s, you didn't really could fully understand it until the Russians came to kill us. And when they came to kill us in 2014, when they came to kill us again in 2022, you get a totally different perception of history and of your own identity of who you are.
Yeah, so following on, we've had a plethora of donations from the West, especially intergovernmental organizations such as NATO, which have pledged all of these military asset donations towards Ukraine to assist with the war. These weapons are capable of immense destruction, such as the Panzer tanks, which were donated recently by Germany, and their use in the war has become hugely beneficial for Ukraine. What do you think of these inherently offensive weapons being used for a defensive measure could result in?
Look, what we've seen, the Russians have employed so many troops on the battlefield in Ukraine that we haven't seen such a big movement of troops since the Second World War. Originally over 200,000 troops went into Ukraine last year. They have attacked us from the north, from the east, and from the south. So we face that attack from all different sides. Initially, our Western friends and allies were reluctant to provide military assistance because their estimate and assessment was that Ukraine is going to fall in a week. Russia is so mighty, they're just going to take over Kiev, and they would just live with that, right? So initially, we only got some weapons for guerrilla war, which included anti-tank missiles, and that was about it. And maybe some Stingers came a bit later, which could be used against helicopters, some aircraft, but it only came later. And when our Western allies have seen that Ukrainians are capable of fighting, that we are capable of mounting a resistance, they started providing that assistance. And it just started. So, it started with air defense systems. Then they've sent the multiple rocket launchers like HIMARS. Then later on, we got the armored personnel carriers, including the Australian Bushmasters, which were dispatched last year. Now already 90 are committed to Ukraine from Australia. And they've started making a difference. Earlier this year, we've seen a tank coalition being shaped up, and tanks provided by Britain, by the US, by Germany. I also encouraged Australia to join the tank coalition as well. Look, what is happening in Ukraine is something we could never imagine happen. Russia has violated the UN Charter. Russia has violated all the basic principles of sovereignty, and they just invade a neighboring country because they believe we don't have a right to exist. And I think the reason why the world, the free world, the democratic world have stood up so strongly with Ukraine, because they understand if you can allow one country to use strength to change borders, creates a very dangerous precedent, which will embolden other authoritarian leaders to change borders by strength. And I think Australia, traditionally, during the First World War, Second World War, has always gone beyond from what its size or population dictates. So Australia was always punching above its weight. And that's hence the reason and the leadership that Australia has been able to demonstrate in this war has been phenomenal. Because now every Bushmaster is not just a handy and hardy piece of military equipment. It's now become that Anzac spirit, that Aussie mateship that we see on the battlefield, that vehicle on 4 wheels, which is going to take us to freedom. And I think that assistance must be sustained. The cost of war is huge. We all bear the brunt of this war, all the misery, all the destruction, and all the human casualties. And we don't need boots on the ground. We just need to have the right gear to be able to repel the Russians. We don't want any piece of Russia. It's easy to say, look, it's very simple. If Russians stop fighting, it's the end of the war. If Ukrainians stop fighting, it's the end of Ukraine.
Can you describe the role that intergovernmental organizations play in providing assistance in this conflict? Organizations such as NATO and the UN.
In terms of NATO, we also have to talk about European Union, which is not an organization. It's already kind of an intergovernmental union already. And a lot of assistance is channeled through the EU and NATO mechanism. So there is coordination on the military assistance, which is provided to Ukraine. And then also there is an EU funding mechanism, which is used to deploy money into the countries which provide assistance to Ukraine so that they can actually commission some new defense industry products for their armies within those countries. So we have a lot of that coordination happens at NATO level and then funded through the EU mechanisms. So we have to talk about them both. But then there are many countries in Europe which are other part of NATO but are not part of the EU. Like, for instance, Norway. They're part of NATO, they're not part of the EU, right? As of recently, Sweden and Finland were part of the EU, but they're not part of NATO, not anymore. Finland is now part of NATO as of yesterday or, earlier this week. And also Sweden is on its route to join NATO, right? So they play a role. With respect to the UN was created after the Second World War. If you read the charter of the UN and the preamble of the UN was created to prevent wars from happening. And it just happened the Soviet Union was one of the founding member nations. But not only the Soviet Union, by the way, it was also the Ukrainian Socialist Republic, which was a founding nation, along with Belarus, of the United Nations. It's interesting, though, our sovereignty was very limited in those days because Soviet Union was comprised of 15 different nations. It's still 3 nations were the founding members, including Ukraine, Belarus, and then Soviet Union in itself, which created the UN. But the way it was designed and the way the design of the permanent members of the Security Council is now very outdated, because having China, Soviet Union, then Britain, France, and the United States as permanent members of the Security Council, and another 10 countries which are rotating every 2 years, the system needs to change. And also to have a permanent member of the UN, like now Russia is, and by the way, nobody has voted for Russia to get the seat legally in the procedures of the UN, and the country which is waging a war, which is violating the fundamental principles and values which are stipulated in the UN Charter, I think it is unacceptable. Also, having a permanent member of the UN, the leader of this country was indicted by the International Criminal Court in The Hague. So that's the first time in history when we have a permanent member of the UN whose leader has been indicted by the International Criminal Court.
And to what extent do you believe that these intergovernmental organizations have control or a role to play in the Ukrainian war?
Look, they have all different roles, and also there are many other organizations. There's also Council of Europe, which is an organization which is dealing with human rights issues. There's also Organization for Cooperation, OEC, for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which was pretty much created at the times for the Cold War, which also has a role. International organizations are important, also with respect to the UN, which of course needs to be changed, which hasn't been able to be very effective in this Russian invasion of Ukraine. Nevertheless, all the international public law relies on the UN system, on the General Assembly and all the procedures. So therefore it was very important for Ukraine on the 23rd of February of this year to get a vote in the UN of 140 nations calling for Ukraine, for the Russian troops to withdraw from Ukraine and calling for the restoration of Ukraine's sovereignty. So we could see that 140 countries are there standing with Ukraine, whereas only 6 or 7 were out there supporting Russia.
So to have a look at the media in the Ukraine-Russian war, for one of the first times in history, unprecedentedly, we have this control over the media over this large war of mostly attrition. It's horrible. So when you look at the media, it has a huge impact on how the everyday person perceives what the war looks like, and it can be manipulated and used by not only governments but also privately owned news resources. Do you believe that the Russian media has an impact on the Ukrainian people?
Russia is using propaganda for the purposes of to justify their invasion of Ukraine, and Russian propaganda should be viewed from different angles. So there is Russian propaganda for their own audience, domestic audience. There is Russian propaganda for the audience in the near abroad, which includes Ukraine and other Russian-speaking countries in the near abroad, as they call it in Russia, including Kazakhstan, including Belarus and other countries. And there is also Russian propaganda and disinformation, which is out there in different other languages, in Arabic and English and French, which is conveyed through Russia Today, which is now called RT or Sputnik or other media resources which Russians are maintaining. They invest in billions of dollars into this media corporation, which are all state-owned corporations that they run. And of course, the purpose of that media holdings that they run is to actually spread that disinformation, spread false stories and fake stories. And you see the way Russian propaganda works, it's different narratives for different audiences. So for the Russian audience, they're telling that it is actually Russia is under attack and they're just fighting back, and they couldn't do, the only thing they could do to fight back was to invade Ukraine. I mean, this is kind of their narrative. For the rest of the world, they often build their stories or narratives on the sentiment which exists in those countries. Like, for instance, in Latin America, Russian disinformation and propaganda is based on anti-American sentiment. Or the same in the Arab world. Or now we see in the global south of the developing countries, they often refer to the post-colonial history, colonial history of those countries, which already have distrust towards the Western nations, where they actually try to tell a story that this whole war is a war of the West against Russia, right? And it's phenomenal that in many countries, general populations become very susceptible to this kind of narratives. Of course, Russians are not winning in the democratic free societies. So it's all the value of free media that we see. Very good reporting here in Australia about the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And I've been following that. We do get some stories on the fringes, which are out there, but they're not dominant. They don't really have much impact, but rather, they're here and there that I see them popped up. But generally, the value of free media for a democratic society is huge. And therefore, it's important to maintain it, because often what's the purpose of Russian propaganda is, and when Russia wants, or China for that matter, sometimes want to undermine a democratic society, they know the weaknesses of the democracy. And the weakness of the democracy is freedom of speech and freedom of press, because at the end of the day, they can use it and abuse it, and they can get their story out there. And because there is so much freedom here, you can't get any story into the Russian or Chinese media space, but they can get stories in here. But their main goal here is different. Here, they will never convince you they can justify their invasion of Ukraine. But what they do here, they try to undermine trust towards your government and tried to undermine trust towards conventional media. Because once you don't trust your government, you don't trust the media, you can believe in any different conspiracy theories. And this is what Russian propaganda is good at, is spreading different conspiracy theories. When Russians downed that MH17 flight, they've spread lots of conspiracy theories that those were Ukrainians targeting an aircraft which was carrying Putin, and they just shot down that plane, and that was a CIA special operation, and plenty of other different conspiracy theories which could be found online. And then all of a sudden, it hasn't become a matter of a fact that actually Russian book system has downed the MH17 flight, but it then became a matter of opinion. And now probably when you go to Malaysia today and ask people who shot down MH17, you'll be surprised that people in Malaysia may have different opinions about that. It doesn't become a matter of fact, it becomes a matter of opinion who shot it down, right? And this is how it works. Very pernicious.
Can you comment on the role of soft power and cultural power in being an ambassador?
Oh, that's soft power is enormous, and there are so many different elements when we talk about soft power, right? But soft power is all about the perception, right?
Yeah.
How do you perceive a country? And often, what's the soft power of Australia? And how do you view it? So for somebody as an outsider, when I think about Australia, of course, everybody thinks about koalas, kangaroos. People think about Australian Open. People have heard about something else, right? But then there are bits and pieces. Then there is some Crocodile Dundee. You don't know this movie, but when I was growing up, it was probably the best film coming out of Australia that everybody in the Soviet Union knew about, right? And that was our view of Australia in those days, right? And this is what soft power is, because soft power is Hollywood for America, and it is Coldplay for Britain, right? And it could be sports, could be entertainment, could be different things. But I think at the end of the day, I sat on a board of a Ukrainian institute, which is a cultural diplomacy outfit in Ukraine, and the main goal of that institute is to promote a cultural exchange, because we talk about performing arts, fine arts, different other cultural cooperation which is out there. And I think this is what helps us shape the perception of the country, because through culture we learn about other countries, and then what is called public diplomacy, cultural diplomacy. In my role as an ambassador, I try to engage as much as possible. Even now, recording this podcast is part of my public diplomacy. I'll reach out. But for instance, when I was recently at a concert of a Ukrainian singer, in Melbourne, that was part of their cultural diplomacy. People could come and listen to Ukrainian singing. There was an exhibition, and you can watch the exhibition and some paintings. So it's very important, because this is what we as humans, this is how we interact with each other. This is how we interact with the outside world, through culture.
The information you've shared with us today is very insightful into the sort of overview of what the war is looking like right now. Of course, things will change, but thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you for being here on the show, Ambassador. It is very much appreciated.
Sure, I really enjoyed it, and wish you a great Easter break, and look forward to hearing more from you, and happy to be back here in a year to give you some of the updates.
Thank you.
Thank you.